There we go. There's the credits. All right. Great, we did it. First things first, the bottom center of the screen says that we've beaten 115 games in 2023 and 437 since we started doing this in 2020. Those numbers are now false. We've now beaten 116 games in 2023 and 438 since we started doing this in 2020. Let's go. All right, so highlights off the bat, like some things that really jump out as exceptionally good in this game. The animation style is second to none when it comes to this kind. Like if you're thinking like games that try to look like hand-drawn 2D animation, it's hard to think of anything that might top this. Cuphead comes to mind, but this is harder than Cuphead, it seems to me. It's got that Into the Spider-Verse, like, slower frame per second look to it that really pops with this animation style, and they nailed it. They nailed the animation style. It looks real good, and it doesn't look like, most of the time, it doesn't look like a video game. It looks like you're playing a cartoon, which is probably pretty hard to pull off. So good job on that. They did really excellent on that. The next thing that comes to mind is the story. The story is... I was more invested in these characters than I am most characters in any video game. They're well-written, well-voiced. Their motivations are all very interesting and understandable. I mean, as is true with many video games, the protagonist is probably the least interesting character. But I think that's intentional. The other characters are all really great, and I was really interested to see where their story was going to go, and it resolved in a way that was pretty satisfying. The music is, there's been a lot of games lately that have done like it's not just a rhythm game like Guitar Hero, but we're going to incorporate a rhythm element, rhythm element into things like combat, BPM, Metal Hellsinger, there's been a lot of those lately, and the only reason I won't say it's the best at it is because BPM exists, and that's one of probably my favorite rhythm game. But outside of that, it does a really great job of making that work, and which is a tall order with the combat. And there are some parts where the seams show a little bit, it makes some of the combat a little awkward since everything kind of has to happen on the beat. It makes me kind of feel like sometimes like there's a lag almost, because when you hit the button, if you're swinging a guitar and swinging a weapon and you don't hit it on the beat, it waits until the beat to do it. So it doesn't feel like I'm totally in control but all the time, but I don't know how to avoid that with this kind of template, and they did a really good job overall with the rhythm elements. And then, of course, just the track list. The music is really good. I won't spoil it in this part of the video, but there's a boss fight about midway through the game that has one of my favorite artists of all time in it, and just instantly that became my favorite boss fight. And so there were several cool moments like that. There's, if you're into 2000s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s music, rock music, I mean, you'll recognize some of the songs. And they're in really cool moments, like boss fights and cool cutscenes and that kind of thing. So I thought that was handled really well. I think that's it as far as like the big highlights of what I really liked the most. We've talked a little bit about the combat. I think the combat was mostly good. There were some moments that like I said, I kind of struggled with the timing. That's really as much a me problem as anything else. It's inherent, it's baked into this formula that you're not, and not everything's going to happen right when you push the button, because everything happens on the rhythm, and that's a little frustrating at times, but it's part of the formula. It's not like that's not working as intended, right? I think my biggest problem with the game was that there were some it's basically, this game is an action platformer. That's what it is at its core. So honestly, outside of the rhythm element, the games that this reminded me the most of were games like Ratchet and Clank, Crash Bandicoot, games with a lot of platforming. It wasn't nearly as brutally difficult as those games, but that's what it reminded me of. More, I guess, Ratchet and Clank more than anything else, because there's a lot of combat as you're doing the platforming, but that's what it reminded me of, and I thought that it did an okay job with the platforming, but there were long stretches, especially earlier in the game, when all you're doing is walking through hallways, just breaking boxes. That happened a lot, when you're just like, all right, I'm just gonna walk to I'm not really jumping, I'm not doing any real platforming. There's also no combat. It felt like they were padding the length of the game a little bit. My thought was, if you're going to have these long hallways where I'm just walking through and nothing's happening, throw some enemies in there. You know, what are we doing? You just want me to walk through hallways? So that was my biggest complaint, was that the game was pretty slow in some parts, especially in the first half. The pacing was a little weird. And I didn't always love it. I felt bored at times because, yeah, breaking boxes for gears and loot and whatever, like craftables and resources and yada yada, it's not the worst time in the world, but throw some enemies in there or something, you know? It felt like there were long stretches of that, especially early. So if I were to give advice, like if they were doing a focus group and I was playing this game, I would say throw some enemies in those parts. Just jazz it up a little bit, you know? It felt a little boring, some of those parts. And then you get back into the platforming and it would be fine again. It would be fun, or there'd be a combat section. It would be fine. But I think they were a little constricted by the format. The way that the combat works in this game, you're walking down a hallway and then suddenly you're in an open area. The combat music starts, you see the enemies, they pop out, and then your meters go up where it's got your S, A, B, C ranking, and your rhythm stuff all shows up, and it's like, okay, now we're in combat. Let's do all the combat stuff. And then when you're done, when you kill all the enemies, and it's like, here's your grade, an A, kind of like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, those kinds of games, kind of did that kind of thing. But because they had it in that format, I guess they decided, well, we don't want there to be any enemies outside of that format. So there would be all these hallways that maybe they originally built to have enemies in them, but they're like, oh, we can't put enemies in there because we don't want to do that whole format. We don't want to have one of those sequences in this hallway. So what, man? Just throw an enemy in there. Throw some enemies in there. It would have been a lot less boring, those parts. So I think at its core, I think that the issue is that they constricted themselves a little too much with that formula, that I guess they felt like they couldn't put enemies anywhere else, and as a result, I thought that the game got a little bit more boring in those sections where you're just walking to get from one point to another, one point of interest to another. And they put some boxes in there to give you something to do, but at the end of the day, that's not that exciting, right? So that's my number one complaint by far. I thought it dragged a little bit, especially early. They were able to get around that a lot easier at the end because there was more platforming, you had more abilities, there was more to do, there was more, you had your companions, there was more to do there. So that was my biggest complaint. I think, I think I'd really be stretching if I came up with anything else. I thought I think some people probably might complain that the humor was pretty tongue-in-cheek and pretty dad-jokey at times, but that was obviously deliberate, and they leaned into that, and I thought that was great. I thought that all the writing and comedy, I out loud laughed a few times. The game's funny. The game's funny, but I could see how some people might have a problem with that. If it's not their style of sense of humor, it could get a little grating, I suppose, but I usually dig that kind of thing. Like a lot of those games that people complain about, like some of the Borderlands games and some of those other games, I'm always like, well, I thought that game was funny. So I didn't have a problem with any of that. I think that's it. I can't think of anything else particularly good or bad. I think overall this game is definitely a success. I hope they decide to make a sequel. It seemed like it was set up for a sequel. And so I would like to see where they go. And there hasn't been a game yet that I've played by Tango Game Softworks or whatever their name, Tango, that I haven't enjoyed. Of course, The Evil Within is one of my very favorite video games of all time, and of course I liked The Evil Within 2 quite a bit as well. I haven't played Ghostwire Tokyo yet, but this is a great studio. I'd like to see what they continue to do in this arena. This is an interesting left turn for them. So, yeah, overall, I really, really enjoyed it. It's not going to rank top 50 just because it doesn't have necessarily... Just because the only real reason is, you know, the amount that it dragged a little bit at the beginning, yes, but mostly just because this game doesn't have my favorite things in it, like Souls-like bosses, colored... Although the bosses were good. The bosses were good. They weren't the best, but they were pretty good. They were pretty good. All right. Okay, so final order of business for this game. Hi-Fi Rush, it's been a blast. I really enjoyed this game, but we are now going to delete you from our console and never play you again. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.